The female spy was about to be exposed until she sang the German national anthem without a flaw. The crystal chandelier cast fragments of light across the ballroom like scattered diamonds, each reflection dancing off the polished medals and silk gowns of Berlin's most powerful elite. In the autumn of 1944, as the Reich fought desperately on two fronts, these gatherings had taken on the fevered quality of parties at the end of the world, more desperate, more decadent, more determined to maintain the illusion that victory was still possible. SS Standartenführer Rolf Müller stood near the champagne fountain, his pale eyes scanning the crowd with the methodical precision of a predator cataloguing prey. At 52, he possessed the patient cruelty of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of uncovering secrets, his weathered face marked by the kind of lines that spoke of too many interrogations conducted in basement rooms where screams were muffled by thick stone walls. Tonight, however, his attention was focused on a single figure moving through the crowd with the grace of royalty born to command, Hannah Schreiber, wife of the brilliant engineer whose V-2 rockets had become Hitler's last desperate hope for turning the tide of war. She was breathtaking in the way that certain women could be breathtaking even in a room full of beauty, her golden hair arranged in perfect waves, her sapphire blue dress cut to emphasize elegance rather than sexuality, her smile carrying just the right mixture of warmth and aristocratic reserve. But it was precisely that perfection that had triggered Müller's suspicions. "Frau Schreiber," he said, intercepting her path to the dance floor, with the smooth efficiency of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You seem to be enjoying the festivities." Hannah turned toward him with the fluid movement of a trained dancer, her smile never wavering, despite the chill that passed through her blue eyes. "How could I not, Standartenführer? A celebration of our nation's strength. It's inspiring." "Inspiring, yes." Müller's smile was sharp as a razor's edge, carrying the particular quality of danger that marked men who found pleasure in the suffering of others. "Your file says you were a music teacher in a small Bavarian village before your marriage. And now, the toast of Berlin. A remarkable transformation." The words were delivered with casual precision, each syllable weighted with implication. Around them, the party continued its glittering dance, Wehrmacht officers waltzing with wives who had learned not to ask too many questions, industrialists toasting profits built on slave labor, party officials celebrating victories that existed only in propaganda broadcasts. But in the small circle of space surrounding Müller and Hannah, the air had grown thick with the kind of tension that preceded violence. "Love changes people," Hannah replied, her voice carrying the slight breathiness that suggested emotion carefully controlled. "Eric showed me a world I never knew existed. I suppose I simply rose to meet it." It was a perfect answer, humble enough to deflect accusations of ambition, romantic enough to satisfy Nazi ideals about women finding fulfillment through their husbands, patriotic enough to pass any test of loyalty. But Müller had not survived 2 decades in the Gestapo by accepting perfect answers at face value. "Indeed," he murmured, his pale eyes studying her face with the intensity of a scientist examining specimens under a microscope. "Though I must confess, I find myself curious about the details of that transformation. Perhaps we might discuss them further. I'm sure our guests would be fascinated to hear about your journey from provincial schoolteacher to Berlin society." The invitation was delivered with the courteous formality that made SS threats seem like social pleasantries. But Hannah understood immediately that she was being maneuvered into a trap. Müller was going to expose her publicly, use the party itself as an arena for her destruction, counting on social pressure and crowd psychology to break her where private interrogation might fail. She glanced around the ballroom, noting the faces that had turned in their direction, the way conversations had grown quieter as guests sensed drama developing. Her husband Eric stood near the orchestra, his face pale with anxiety, as he recognized the danger approaching his wife. The Swiss cultural attaché, Dubois, watched from beside the refreshment table with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to survive in occupied Europe by seeing everything and revealing nothing. "I would be honored," Hannah said, inclining her head with gracious acceptance, "though I fear my story is hardly as fascinating as you suggest." Mueller's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp for polite society. "Modesty becomes you, Frau Schreiber. But I think our friends here deserve to hear from someone who embodies the very best of German womanhood." He raised his champagne glass, the crystal catching the chandelier light as he called for attention with the authority of absolute power. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I might have your attention for a moment." The ballroom fell silent with the instant obedience that marked gatherings of people who had learned to fear the consequences of appearing inattentive to SS commands. 200 faces turned toward Mueller and Hannah, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed dread at what might be about to unfold. "We are honored tonight to have among us Frau Hannah Schreiber," Mueller announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent space, "a woman whose transformation from simple village teacher to devoted wife of one of our Reich's most brilliant minds represents everything we hope to achieve in our glorious 1,000-year future." Polite applause rippled through the crowd, but Hannah could feel the undercurrent of tension, the way people leaned forward slightly as they sensed that this was not going to be a simple tribute. "In fact," Mueller continued, his pale eyes locked on Hannah's face, "I believe Frau Schreiber would be the perfect person to lead us in our national anthem tonight. After all, who better to express the pure devotion of German patriotism than someone who has embraced our values so completely?" The trap was perfect in its simplicity. If she refused, she would appear unpatriotic, suspicious, possibly treasonous. If she accepted, Mueller was counting on her to stumble over words she might not know perfectly, to reveal through accent or inflection that she was not what she claimed to be. Either way, he would have his proof that something was wrong with the perfect Hannah Schreiber. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, heavy with expectation and danger. Hannah could feel 200 pairs of eyes weighing her response, measuring her loyalty, waiting to see whether she would prove worthy of the trust the Reich had placed in her. For just an instant, her mask slipped. Not visibly, years of training had taught her too much for that. But internally, where the Polish girl named Katarzyna stirred beneath the German woman named Hannah, she thought of her parents, burned alive in the rubble of Warsaw. She thought of her brother, shot down like a dog in the street for the crime of trying to defend his family. She thought of the children she would never have, the life she would never live, the woman she might have been in a world that hadn't taught her that survival required becoming everything she hated. Then the moment passed, and Hannah Schreiber smiled with the radiant confidence of a woman who had nothing to hide. "It would be my honor, Standartenführer," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, "though I hope you'll forgive me if emotion overcomes me. The beauty of our anthem sometimes moves me to tears." She stepped forward into the center of the room, her sapphire dress catching the light as she moved with the fluid grace of someone who belonged exactly where she stood. The orchestra, sensing the weight of the moment, positioned themselves to provide accompaniment, their conductor's baton raised in readiness. Hannah closed her eyes for just a moment, not in prayer, but in preparation, calling up from the depths of her trained memory every lesson she had learned about becoming the perfect German woman. When she opened them again, she was no longer just performing a role. She had become the role, channeling every ounce of patriotic fervor that a true daughter of the Reich might feel. The first notes rose from her throat like liquid gold, pure and powerful, and carrying such emotional weight that several women in the crowd gasped audibly. Her voice soared through the ballroom, filling every corner with sound that seemed to come not just from her vocal cords, but from the very essence of her being. Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles in der Welt, wenn es stets zu Schutz und Trutze, brüderlich Zusammenhalt. But it was not just the technical perfection of her performance that stunned the assembled guests. It was the raw emotion she poured into every word. Tears streamed down her face as she sang, her voice breaking with what appeared to be overwhelming love for the fatherland. She sang as if the anthem was a prayer, as if Germany itself was sacred, as if every note was an offering placed at the altar of racial destiny. The effect on the crowd was electric. Hardened SS officers found themselves wiping away tears. Party officials who had heard the anthem thousands of times felt as if they were experiencing it for the first time. Even Müller, despite his suspicions, seemed momentarily moved by the sheer force of her performance. When she reached the final verse, Hannah's voice rose to a crescendo that seemed to touch the very rafters of the ballroom, her arms spreading wide as if to embrace the entire Reich in her declaration of love. The last note hung in the air for a moment that felt like eternity, perfect and pure, and containing within it everything that the assembled guests believed about their destiny as the master race. Then silence, absolute and profound, broken only by the sound of Hannah's quiet sobbing as she covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the emotion of her performance. The applause, when it came, was thunderous. Men who had conquered nations stood and cheered as if they had witnessed a religious miracle. Women wept openly, moved beyond words by what they had just experienced. Even the orchestra members, professionals who had heard countless performances, seemed stunned by what they had witnessed. Müller stood frozen, his trap turned against him with devastating effectiveness. To question Hannah's loyalty now would be to question the loyalty of everyone in the room, all of whom had been moved to patriotic fervor by her performance. He had been outmaneuvered completely, forced to applaud the woman he had tried to destroy. "Magnificent," declared Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Krantz, one of the most powerful men in the Reich's armaments program, as he approached Hannah with tears still glistening in his eyes. "Absolutely magnificent. I have never heard our anthem sung with such pure devotion." Other high-ranking officials crowded around her, competing to offer their congratulations, to bask in the reflected glory of her patriotic display. In the span of 5 minutes, Hannah had transformed from Müller's target into the most celebrated woman in Berlin. Her loyalty beyond question, her status as a true daughter of the Reich, confirmed by the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. As the crowd pressed around her, accepting their praise with gracious humility, Hannah allowed herself one quick glance toward Müller. The Gestapo officer stood alone now, his pale eyes burning with frustrated rage, his perfect trap turned into his own humiliation. But she could see in his expression that this was far from over. If anything, her victory had only made him more determined to prove that she was not what she seemed. The game had entered a new phase, one where the stakes would be higher and the dangers more acute. But for tonight at least, the Nightingale had sung her way to safety, using the enemy's own devotion against them, in a performance that would be remembered throughout the Reich. She had done more than survive Müller's trap. She had transformed it into the foundation of her greatest triumph. 3 years earlier, Warsaw, September 1941. The woman who would become Hannah Schreiber knelt in the rubble of what had once been her family's apartment building, her hands bloody from digging through concrete and twisted metal in search of bodies that might still be recognizable as human. The Luftwaffe's latest demonstration had targeted the civilian quarter where teachers and clerks and shopkeepers had lived their quiet lives, turning an entire city block into a monument to German efficiency. Katarzyna Kowalski was 26 years old, a music teacher at the local gymnasium, unmarried by choice and content with a life measured in small pleasures: her students' progress, evening concerts, books borrowed from the library that somehow still functioned despite the occupation. She had been giving a piano lesson 3 blocks away when the bombs fell, the sound of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata mixing grotesquely with the whistle of descending death. Now she pulled her mother's hand from beneath a fallen beam, the fingers still wearing the wedding ring that had survived 43 years of marriage, only to be ended by 20 seconds of modern warfare. Her father's body lay nearby, his chest crushed, but his face peaceful, as if he had died thinking of better times. Her brother Tomasz had been found in the courtyard, still clutching the book he had been reading when the world exploded around him. "You need to come with us now," said the man who stood in the smoking doorway, his voice gentle but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. Jan Kowalski, no relation despite the name, was 45 years old and had been recruiting for the Polish Home Army since the first week of occupation, identifying people whose grief might be transformed into useful anger. "I'm not finished," Katarzyna replied, without looking up, her voice hollow with shock. "I need to find all of them. I need to make sure they're properly buried. The Germans will bulldoze this site tomorrow morning," Jan said matter-of-factly. "Mass grave, no markers, no prayers. If you want their deaths to mean something more than random statistics, you'll come with me now." She looked up at him then, her blue eyes bright with tears and something harder. "What are you offering?" "The chance to hurt them back. The chance to make every bomb they drop cost them something precious in return." He gestured toward the ruins that stretched in every direction, block after block of destroyed lives. "Your family is gone, Miss Kowalski. You can join them in the ground, or you can help us make sure other families don't suffer the same fate." 3 days later, she was in a farmhouse outside the city, beginning a transformation that would be more complete than anything the Nazis had achieved through their racial theories and Lebensraum programs. The Home Army had identified a specific need: deep cover operatives who could penetrate the highest levels of German society, gathering intelligence that could only be obtained through intimate access to the enemy's inner circles. "You speak German well," observed Colonel Kazimierz Sosnkowski, the regional commander who had approved her recruitment. "Where did you learn?" "My grandmother was from Silesia," Katarzyna replied. "She insisted I learn properly. Said it was important to understand your neighbors, even if you didn't like them." "And your musical training?" "Conservatory level. I can play piano, violin, sing in 4 languages. Before the war, I had planned to audition for the Warsaw Opera." Sosnkowski nodded, making notes in her file with the precision of a man who understood that details saved lives. "Good. We're going to make you into the perfect German woman, more German than the Germans themselves. You'll need to forget everything you were and become everything they want you to be." The training was unlike anything she had imagined possible. For 18 months, Katarzyna lived in a series of safe houses where Polish patriots taught her to think like a Nazi, to feel like a member of the master race, to embody every ideal the Reich promoted about Aryan womanhood. She studied German poetry until she could recite Goethe from memory, learned Wagner's operas by heart, practiced the subtle social cues that marked true aristocracy from mere wealth. But it was more than cultural education. It was psychological reconstruction. Under the guidance of a former professor of psychology who had lost his position for refusing to endorse racial theory, she learned to separate her conscious mind from her core identity, to create a mental partition that would allow Hannah Schreiber to exist completely while Katarzyna Kowalski remained buried, but intact. "You must become her," the professor explained during one of their sessions in the basement of an abandoned church. "Not pretend to be her, not act like her. Actually become her. She must have her own memories, her own emotions, her own dreams and fears. If you try to maintain conscious control over the performance, you will be discovered within days." They gave her a complete backstory. Birth in a small Bavarian village, parents killed in an automobile accident, education at a teacher's college, work in rural schools where records had been conveniently destroyed by Allied bombing. Every detail was researched and verified, every document forged by craftsmen who had spent decades perfecting their art. Most importantly, they gave her a mission that would justify the enormous investment in her training. Eric Schreiber, a brilliant engineer working on the Reich's rocket program, recently widowed and known to frequent cultural events where he might meet an appropriate second wife. Intelligence suggested he was not a committed Nazi, simply a patriotic German who wanted his country to win the war, making him potentially vulnerable to the right kind of feminine influence. "Your job is to marry him," Colonel Sosenkowski explained during her final briefing. "Make him love you, make him trust you, make him dependent on your social connections for his career advancement. Then gather everything you can about his work, schedules, locations, technical specifications, anything that might help the Allies target their rocket production. And after I gather the intelligence, that depends on how valuable you prove to be. If you're discovered, you die. If you remain effective, you continue until the war ends, or you're no longer useful." His expression softened slightly. "I won't lie to you, Miss Kowalski. This is likely a one-way mission. The woman who enters Berlin may never come home." Katarzyna, who was already becoming Hannah in her mind, thinking in German more often than Polish, dreaming of Bavarian mountains instead of Warsaw streets, nodded with calm acceptance. "My family is already dead. If I can prevent other families from suffering the same fate, it's worth any sacrifice." Berlin, December 1942. Hannah Schreiber met Eric at a Christmas concert featuring the Berlin Philharmonic. Wearing a navy blue dress that suggested good breeding without ostentation, her golden hair arranged in the kind of understated elegance that marked women who had never needed to work for their beauty. She had positioned herself carefully in the lobby during intermission, studying a program with the absorbed attention of someone genuinely passionate about music. "Magnificent performance of the Beethoven," Eric said, approaching with the slightly awkward manner of a brilliant man who was more comfortable with equations than social interaction, though I thought the tempo in the second movement was perhaps a bit rushed. Hannah looked up with the kind of delighted surprise that suggested she had found a kindred spirit in an unexpected place. "Yes, I noticed that too. Furtwängler usually takes those passages more slowly, gives them room to breathe." They talked through the remaining intermission and continued their conversation over coffee after the concert, discovering a shared love of music, literature, and the kind of cultural refinement that seemed increasingly rare in wartime Berlin. Eric was charmed by her intelligence, her evident breeding, her passionate but thoughtful patriotism that seemed to spring from genuine love of country rather than political calculation. "I hope you won't think me too forward," he said as they prepared to part ways, "but I would very much like to see you again. Perhaps you would join me for dinner this weekend." "I would be delighted," Hannah replied, her smile carrying just the right mixture of pleasure and modest reservation. "Though I should warn you, I'm quite particular about restaurants. Growing up in Bavaria spoiled me for anything less than perfection." It was a carefully crafted response, establishing her background while suggesting standards that would appeal to a man of Eric's social position. Over the following months, their courtship proceeded with the kind of dignified progression that marked relationships between people of quality: formal dinners, cultural events, long walks through Tiergarten, where they discussed everything from Wagner's use of leitmotifs to the philosophical implications of rocket technology. Eric fell in love gradually and completely, charmed by her grace, her intelligence, her ability to move seamlessly through Berlin's highest social circles, while maintaining the kind of authentic warmth that suggested genuine feeling beneath polished manners. When he proposed, kneeling in his apartment amid bouquets of white roses while a string quartet played Mozart in the background, Hannah's tears of joy were absolutely genuine. Not because she loved him, but because she had finally achieved the access that would allow her to complete her mission. The wedding was a small but elegant affair, attended by the cream of Berlin society, scientists, generals, party officials, and their wives who competed to outdo each other in demonstrating proper National Socialist values. Hannah wore her grandmother's pearls and carried white orchids, looking every inch the perfect Aryan bride, as she promised to love, honor, and obey the man whose secrets she planned to steal. Their marriage quickly became one of Berlin's social centerpieces. Hannah proved to be a gifted hostess, organizing dinner parties and cultural events that brought together the most powerful figures in the Reich's scientific and military establishments. She listened with fascination as generals discussed strategy, asked intelligent questions when engineers explained their latest innovations, and remembered every detail with the trained precision of a professional intelligence operative. Gradually, carefully, she began to extract information from her husband and his colleagues, not through dramatic seductions or obvious spycraft, but through the simple expedient of being the kind of wife that successful men wanted to impress with their important work. Eric shared blueprints over breakfast, discussed production schedules during evening walks, complained about bureaucratic obstacles with the trust of a man who had never learned to doubt the woman he loved. For 2 years, Hannah lived this double life with consummate skill, gathering intelligence that helped Allied bombers target German production facilities while maintaining her position as one of Berlin's most celebrated hostesses. She had become so thoroughly German that even she sometimes forgot she had ever been anyone else, the psychological walls between Katarzyna and Hannah growing stronger with each passing month. But SS Standartenführer Müller had been watching, cataloguing small inconsistencies, noting the way she sometimes paused before responding to questions about her childhood, the occasional word choice that suggested education different from what her background should have provided. He was a patient hunter, content to gather evidence slowly rather than risk alerting his prey to the closing trap. Until tonight, when he had finally decided to spring that trap in the most public way possible, using the party itself as his weapon. He had not counted on her decision to fight back with the one weapon no German could question, the pure, passionate voice of absolute patriotism. The weeks following Hannah's triumph at the gala brought opportunities beyond her most optimistic projections. Her performance of the national anthem had transformed her from mere society hostess into something approaching a symbol of German womanhood at its finest, beautiful, cultured, passionately patriotic, and unshakably loyal to the Reich. Invitations poured in from the highest levels of Nazi society, each one representing potential access to intelligence that could save Allied lives. Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Krantz, still moved by her emotional performance, personally invited her to accompany Eric to a private demonstration of the latest V2 guidance systems at Peenemünde. Such dedication to the fatherland deserves to be rewarded with a glimpse of our ultimate victory, he declared, his weathered face bright with the fervor of a true believer. Your husband's work represents the future of warfare, and you should be proud to witness it firsthand. The opportunity was unprecedented, direct access to the Reich's most classified military installation, the chance to observe and photograph technical specifications that could allow Allied forces to develop countermeasures against Germany's terror weapons. But Hannah understood that the invitation came with commensurate risks. The higher her profile rose, the more intensely Mueller would scrutinize every aspect of her manufactured identity. She found evidence of that scrutiny in small details that would have been invisible to anyone not trained in operational security. Her mail was being opened with slightly more care than wartime censorship required. The tiny marks she left on envelopes revealing that someone was photographing her correspondence before resealing it. The cleaning woman who came twice weekly was asking questions about family photographs, showing the kind of curiosity that suggested professional interest rather than mere gossip. Most ominously, she began noticing the same faces in different locations. A woman in a grey coat who appeared at both her hairdresser and the market where she shopped for dinner parties. A young man who seemed to frequent the same cafes she visited for her afternoon reading. Mueller was building a surveillance network around her, gathering evidence with the patience of a man who understood that rushing toward conclusions could destroy months of careful investigation. "You seem troubled lately," Eric observed one evening as they prepared for bed in their elegant Charlottenburg apartment. "Is something bothering you, darling?" Hannah paused in brushing her hair, meeting his eyes in the mirror with the kind of vulnerable honesty that marked their most intimate conversations. "It's silly, really, but I've been feeling watched lately, as if someone is always observing, always judging." It was a masterful response, close enough to the truth to carry emotional authenticity while providing a plausible explanation for any nervous behavior Eric might have noticed. She had learned that the best lies were built on foundations of partial truth, allowing her genuine emotions to support fabricated explanations. Eric's reflection showed immediate concern. Watched by whom? I don't know exactly. That Standartenführer Mueller, perhaps. The way he looks at me sometimes, as if he's trying to solve a puzzle. I know I should be honored by his attention. He's clearly an important man. But something about him makes me uncomfortable. Mueller has that effect on everyone, Eric replied, crossing the room to place gentle hands on her shoulders. He sees enemies everywhere, suspects everyone of harboring secrets. It's the nature of his work, I suppose. But it makes social interaction rather unpleasant. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of the expensive perfume that had become part of Hannah's signature style. "You have nothing to worry about, my love. Your loyalty to the Reich is beyond question. Even Mueller can't manufacture disloyalty where none exists." But Hannah knew that loyalty was not the issue. Competent fabrication was. If Mueller discovered any flaw in her background, any detail that couldn't withstand intensive scrutiny, her passionate performance of the national anthem would become evidence of calculating deception rather than proof of patriotic fervor. The challenge came to a head during a reception at the Swiss embassy, where the cultural attaché Dubois was hosting an evening of chamber music performed by German artists for an audience of diplomatic and military officials. Hannah attended with Eric, wearing a black silk dress that suggested sophistication without ostentation, her manner perfectly calibrated to the kind of cultured restraint that marked women of genuine breeding. She was discussing the technical merits of the Mozart performance with the wife of a Luftwaffe general when she noticed Mueller approaching through the crowd, his pale eyes fixed on her with predatory intensity. This time he was not alone. Behind him walked a middle-aged woman with the kind of precise features that suggested Bavarian origin, her dress conservative but expensive, her manner suggesting someone unaccustomed to Berlin's sophisticated society. "Frau Schreiber," Muller said with his razor-sharp smile, "what a pleasure to see you again. I've brought someone who claims to know you from your childhood in Bavaria, Frau Gertrud Weber from Rosenheim. She says she was your neighbor for several years." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. If Hannah recognized the woman, she would have to sustain a conversation about shared memories that didn't exist. If she didn't recognize her, she would have to explain how she could have forgotten a long-time neighbor from her small village childhood. Either way, Mueller was counting on inconsistencies that would expose her fabricated background. Hannah turned towards the stranger with the kind of delighted surprise that suggested pleasant memories suddenly recalled. "Frau Weber, how wonderful to see you again after so many years." She extended both hands in greeting, her smile warm, but carrying a note of uncertainty. "Forgive me, but you look so different from how I remember you." "Time has been very kind." It was a perfect response, acknowledging the connection while providing a reason for any confusion about specific details. But Frau Weber was studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to match a photograph to a living person. "Yes," the woman said slowly, "you've certainly changed as well. Though I must say, I don't recall you being quite so tall, or having such fair hair." The observation was delivered with the kind of innocent confusion that suggested genuine memory rather than malicious testing. But Hannah could see Mueller's pale eyes brighten with interest, sensing an opening in her defenses. "Oh, I was quite the beanpole as a child," Hannah laughed, the sound carrying exactly the right note of embarrassed admission. "And Mother always said my hair would darken with age, but somehow it never did. I suppose I was destined to remain the blonde giant of the family." She turned to Mueller with the kind of conspiratorial amusement that drew him into the conversation. "I'm sure Frau Weber remembers what an awkward creature I was, all elbows and knees, absolutely hopeless at anything requiring grace." "Actually," Frau Weber said with growing confusion, "I don't recall you being particularly tall or awkward. In fact, I remember you as quite petite and very coordinated. Didn't you win several prizes for dancing at the village festivals?" The silence that followed stretched like a drawn wire, heavy with implications that could destroy everything Hannah had built. Muller's smile was growing wider, sensing that his careful preparation was finally paying dividends. Other guests had begun to notice the tension, their conversations faltering as they sensed drama developing in their midst. But before Hannah could respond, the Swiss cultural attaché Dubois appeared at her elbow with the smooth efficiency of a professional diplomat, averting international incidents. "Frau Schreiber," he exclaimed in accented German, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw attention from nearby guests. "I've been looking everywhere for you. The Baroness von Stauffen is absolutely insisting that you must meet her daughter. Apparently the girl is studying voice, and the Baroness heard about your magnificent performance at the Krantz Gala." He gestured toward a cluster of elegantly dressed women near the piano, his manner suggesting urgent social obligations that could not be delayed. "She's leaving for Munich tomorrow morning, so this is our only opportunity. Would you mind terribly if I stole Frau Schreiber away?" Diplomatic necessity, I'm afraid. The interruption was perfectly timed and completely plausible, the kind of social emergency that occurred regularly at embassy functions where important people expected immediate attention to their requests. Mueller could hardly object without appearing to prioritize his personal curiosity over diplomatic courtesy. "Of course," Hannah said, offering Frau Weber an apologetic smile. "Perhaps we can continue our conversation later. I'm so sorry to be pulled away just as we were getting reacquainted." As Dubois escorted her across the room, she could feel Mueller's pale eyes burning into her back, his frustration at the interrupted interrogation almost palpable. But the moment had passed, the trap had been avoided, and she was once again free to move through Berlin society under the protection of her carefully cultivated reputation. "Thank you," she murmured to Dubois as they approached the cluster of aristocratic women near the piano. "Think nothing of it," the Swiss diplomat replied in fluent Polish, his voice so quiet that only she could hear, "though I suspect our German friend will be less easily diverted next time." The brief exchange in her native language hit Hannah like a physical blow, her carefully maintained composure flickering for just an instant before reasserting itself. Dubois knew. Somehow, the neutral diplomat had penetrated her cover, identified her as something other than the perfect German wife she appeared to be. But as she was introduced to the Baroness von Stauffen and her aspiring vocalist daughter, Hannah understood that Dubois had not exposed her secret in order to threaten her. He had revealed it to offer protection. In the shadowy world of wartime diplomacy, even neutral powers sometimes chose sides through actions rather than declarations. The game was becoming more complex by the day, but she was still playing, still gathering the intelligence that could help end the war that had already cost her everything she had once loved. The nightingale continued to sing, even as the hunters closed in around her. The train to Peenemünde cut through the German countryside like a steel serpent carrying secrets towards the Baltic coast, its windows reflecting the autumn landscape that had become a canvas for total war. Eric sat beside his wife in their first-class compartment, reviewing technical documents with the absorbed concentration of a man whose work had become synonymous with his country's survival. Across the aisle, Oberfuhrer Krantz held court with a cluster of military officials, their conversation mixing strategic planning with the kind of gallows humor that marked men living on borrowed time. Hannah gazed out the window at farmland that had been stripped to feed the Reich's war machine, noting the absence of young men in fields where women and elderly farmers struggled to bring in harvests that would never be adequate to feed a hungry nation. The landscape told the story of a country consuming itself to fuel its appetite for conquest, cannibalizing its own future in pursuit of victories that grew more Pyrrhic with each passing month. But her external calm concealed the racing calculations of a trained operative preparing for the most dangerous mission of her career. Hidden beneath the silk lining of her purse was a camera no larger than a cigarette case, its lens designed to photograph documents from distances that would appear casual to any observer. In her memory, she carried a mental map of Peenemunde's layout, compiled from months of careful intelligence gathering, guard stations, restricted areas, document repositories, communication centers. Most importantly, she understood that this visit represented both her greatest opportunity and her greatest risk. The intelligence she might gather could provide Allied forces with targeting information that would cripple Germany's rocket program, potentially saving thousands of lives in London and other cities under bombardment. But if she were discovered, if Mueller's suspicions led to heightened security that exposed her activities, she would die knowing that her sacrifice had accomplished nothing beyond satisfying her personal need for vengeance. "Nervous about seeing the demonstration?" Eric asked, noticing the way her hands rested motionless in her lap, the stillness that marked her moments of intense concentration. "Excited, rather," Hannah replied, turning to him with the kind of smile that suggested wifely pride in her husband's achievements. "It's not every woman who gets to witness history being made, though I confess I'm a bit overwhelmed by the technical aspects. I hope I won't embarrass you by asking elementary questions." Eric's expression softened with the mixture of affection and protective pride that had characterized their relationship from its beginning. "You could never embarrass me, darling. Your questions are always intelligent, even when you think they're not. Besides, the best engineers are those who can explain complex concepts in simple terms." The conversation was perfectly natural, the kind of exchange that occurred between loving spouses traveling to important professional events. But beneath the surface, Hannah was using the opportunity to establish her cover story for the day ahead, the devoted wife whose innocent curiosity about her husband's work would provide plausible justification for her presence in restricted areas. "Will I be able to see the actual rockets?" she asked, injecting just enough breathless anticipation into her voice to suggest feminine excitement at witnessing masculine achievement. "Some of them," Eric confirmed. Krantz has arranged for you to observe the guidance system demonstration from the technical gallery. You'll see everything we're working on, though obviously you won't be permitted in the classified assembly areas. Perfect. The technical gallery overlooked the main demonstration floor, where the most sensitive documents would be displayed for the visiting officials. From that vantage point, her camera would have clear lines of sight to charts, specifications, and deployment schedules that Allied intelligence had been trying to obtain for months. The compound at Peenemünde sprawled across the island like a small city, dedicated entirely to the manufacture of technological terror. Concrete bunkers housed assembly lines where V-2 rockets took shape under the hands of slave laborers whose life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. Testing towers rose like metallic cathedrals where guidance systems were calibrated to deliver death with mathematical precision. Everything was designed with the kind of brutal efficiency that marked German engineering at its most coldly effective. Security was intense, but followed predictable patterns. Guards checked identification with mechanical thoroughness, but they focused on preventing unauthorized entry rather than monitoring the behavior of pre-approved visitors. Hannah's presence as Eric's wife, coupled with Krantz's personal endorsement, provided her with access that would have taken months to achieve through traditional espionage methods. The demonstration itself was held in a vast hangar where a full-scale V-2 rocket stood like a monument to Germany's desperate technological reach for victory. Charts covered the walls showing trajectory calculations, payload specifications, and, most crucially, deployment schedules for the upcoming months. High-ranking officials clustered around display tables where guidance components were arranged with the precision of surgical instruments. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Krantz observed as he joined Hannah in the technical gallery, his weathered face bright with the pride of a man who believed he was witnessing the future of warfare. Each rocket represents the culmination of centuries of German scientific achievement. "It's almost too much to comprehend," Hannah replied with appropriate awe, positioning herself near the gallery's railing, where her camera would have optimal angles for photographing the displays below. The precision required must be extraordinary. Indeed, every component must function perfectly. Every calculation must be exact. A single error in guidance programming could send a rocket hundreds of miles off target. Krantz gestured toward a chart showing London's defensive positions overlaid with planned impact zones. But when everything works as designed, the results are devastatingly effective. Hannah nodded with fascination while her trained eyes catalogued every detail visible from her position. Launch schedules showed V-2 attacks planned against London, Antwerp, and Paris over the next 3 months. Targeting data revealed the precise coordinates German forces planned to strike. Production figures indicated that rocket manufacturing was running behind schedule due to sabotage at component factories, information that could help Allied bombers prioritize their targets. But it was the guidance system specifications that represented the most valuable intelligence. If Allied engineers could understand how German rockets navigated to their targets, they might be able to develop jamming techniques that would render the weapons ineffective. The technical drawings spread across the display tables below contained information that could save thousands of civilian lives. Moving with casual grace, Hannah began photographing the displays, her camera concealed within what appeared to be an elegant lady's purse. Each image was captured during moments when nearby officials were distracted by the demonstration, the camera's silent mechanism leaving no evidence of her activities. "The guidance system is particularly ingenious," Krantz continued, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of a teacher explaining complex concepts to an interested student. Gyroscopic stabilization combined with radio beacon targeting allows for unprecedented accuracy over long distances. "How remarkable," Hannah murmured, using his explanation as cover to photograph the guidance system blueprints spread across a nearby table. "Eric has tried to explain such things to me. but I'm afraid the mathematics are quite beyond my comprehension. Understandable. These systems represent the work of our finest minds. Von Braun, Thiel, Claus himself. Germany's intellectual superiority, made manifest in steel and engineering. The demonstration proceeded for nearly 2 hours, with officials examining components, reviewing specifications, and discussing deployment strategies with the kind of detailed attention that revealed the importance they placed on the rocket program. Hannah photographed everything within reach of her position, building a comprehensive intelligence file that would provide Allied forces with unprecedented insight into German capabilities and intentions. But as the formal presentation concluded and guests began to move toward the reception area, she noticed a familiar figure entering the hangar, SS Standartenführer Müller, his pale eyes scanning the crowd with the methodical precision of a hunter tracking prey. Their gazes met across the vast space, and Hannah saw something new in his expression. Not just suspicion, but certainty. Whatever investigation he had been conducting into her background had yielded results that satisfied his paranoid instincts. He was no longer gathering evidence. He was preparing to act on conclusions already reached. "Darling," Eric appeared at her elbow, his face flushed with the excitement of professional recognition. "Krantz wants to introduce you to some of the other engineers' wives. Apparently your performance at the gala has made quite an impression throughout the scientific community." "Of course," Hannah replied, though her attention remained focused on Mueller's approach through the crowd. "Though I hope they won't expect another impromptu performance. I'm not sure I could manage such emotion twice in 1 month." It was a perfectly crafted response, humble but acknowledging her previous triumph while establishing that emotional performances were special occasions rather than routine capabilities. But she could see that Mueller was positioning himself to intercept their group before they could reach the reception area, his movements suggesting a man who had finally decided to spring his carefully prepared trap. "Herr Schreiber." Mueller's voice carried across the hangar with official authority. "A moment, if you please. There are some security matters that require immediate attention." Eric's face paled at the summons, his mind immediately jumping to the kind of security breaches that could destroy careers and end lives in wartime Germany. "Security matters. I don't understand." "Nothing that reflects on your work," Mueller assured him with false smoothness. "Rather, some questions about your wife's background that require clarification before she can be permitted to attend future demonstrations of this classification level." The trap was perfectly constructed, using Eric's love for his wife against him, forcing him to choose between protecting Hannah and preserving his own position within the rocket program. Mueller was counting on Eric's devotion to override his professional instincts, expecting him to demand answers that would expose the inconsistencies in Hannah's fabricated identity. But Hannah understood that the game had reached its end game. Mueller's investigation had uncovered something that gave him confidence to move openly against her, regardless of her previous triumphs or current social standing. Whatever evidence he possessed, it was sufficient to overcome the protection her reputation had provided. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," Eric said, his voice tight with anxiety, but still carrying the authority of a man whose work was essential to the Reich's survival. "My wife's loyalty is beyond question." "Of course it is," Mueller agreed with predatory patience. "But loyalty is not the issue, Herr Schreiber. Identity is, and I'm afraid your wife is not quite who she claims to be." The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. Around them, other guests had begun to notice the confrontation, their conversations faltering as they sensed drama developing in their midst. Hannah felt the familiar calmness that had sustained her through 2 years of deception settling over her like armor. The mission was compromised, her cover was blown, but the intelligence she had gathered was still valuable enough to justify any sacrifice required to preserve it. Her hand moved almost imperceptibly towards the small pill sewn into her dress collar, the final insurance that would prevent her from revealing operational details under interrogation. But before Mueller could continue his accusation, before Eric could demand explanations that would destroy everything she had built, a new voice cut through the tension with the authority of absolute power. Standartenführer Mueller. Oberfuhrer Krantz approached with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to resolving problems through the application of superior rank. What seems to be the difficulty here? Mueller straightened with the automatic deference that marked SS officers addressing their superiors, but his pale eyes remained fixed on Hannah with predatory intensity. Sir, I have reason to believe that Frau Schreiber's identity requires additional verification before she can be permitted access to classified demonstrations. Additional verification? Kranz's voice carried the dangerous quiet that preceded explosions of official anger. Are you suggesting that I lack the competence to properly screen guests for security demonstrations under my direct authority? The question was loaded with implications that could destroy Mueller's career if he answered incorrectly. Krantz was not just challenging his judgment, he was defending his own professional reputation against implied criticism from a subordinate. Not at all, sir, Mueller replied carefully. I merely believe that certain discrepancies in Frau Schreiber's background warrant further investigation to ensure. Discrepancies? Kranz's voice rose with genuine indignation. The woman who sang our national anthem with such passion that grown men wept, the wife of one of our most brilliant engineers, the embodiment of German womanhood at its finest. He gestured toward Hannah with theatrical flourish, his weathered face bright with remembered emotion. I was present at that performance, Standartenführer. I witnessed her devotion to the fatherland, expressed with such purity that it moved me to tears. Are you suggesting that such perfect patriotism could be fabricated? The public confrontation had reached the point where any response from Mueller would constitute either professional insubordination or implicit criticism of Kranz's competence. Around them, other guests watched with the fascinated attention of people witnessing a power struggle between high-ranking officials. Perhaps, Hannah said quietly, her voice carrying just enough tremor to suggest emotional distress. It would be better if I withdrew from future events. I have no wish to create difficulties for my husband's important work. It was a masterful response, accepting implicit criticism while positioning herself as the victim of overzealous security measures. By offering to sacrifice her own access rather than defend her credentials, she appeared to be placing Eric's career above her personal pride. Absolutely not, Krantz declared with finality. I will not permit bureaucratic paranoia to insult a woman whose devotion to Germany is beyond question. Frau Schreiber's presence at future demonstrations is not just permitted. It is welcomed as an honor to our program. The dismissal was complete and public, leaving Mueller with no option but to retreat or face disciplinary action for challenging his superior's judgment. His pale eyes burned with frustrated rage, but he stepped back with the rigid control of a man who understood when tactical withdrawal was necessary. Of course, sir, he said through gritted teeth. I defer to your judgment in all security matters. But as the crowd dispersed towards the reception area, as Eric's relief became visible in his relaxed posture and grateful smile, Hannah understood that she had won only a temporary reprieve. Muller's investigation would continue, his evidence would accumulate, and eventually he would find a way to expose her that even Kranz's protection could not deflect. The intelligence she had gathered was complete, but getting it to Allied handlers would require resources and skills that went far beyond social deception. The Nightingale had sung her way to safety once again, but the song was nearing its end. The time had come for Katarzyna Kowalski to reclaim her identity from the perfect German woman who had served her purpose so well. The return journey to Berlin passed in tense silence. Eric's earlier excitement replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man who had witnessed his professional and personal worlds collide with potentially catastrophic consequences. He sat rigidly in their first-class compartment, staring out the window at countryside that seemed to mock them with its peaceful indifference to human disasters. "You're angry with me," Hannah observed as the train pulled away from Peenemünde station, her voice carrying the particular vulnerability that marked conversations between spouses who had learned to read each other's moods with painful accuracy. "Not angry," Eric replied, without turning from the window. "Confused, frightened. Mueller isn't given to making accusations without substantial evidence, yet Kranz's defense of you was absolute. I find myself wondering what's really happening here." The admission hung between them like a sword suspended by increasingly frayed threads. In 2 years of marriage, Eric had never questioned Hannah's background, never doubted the stories she told about her childhood in Bavaria, never suspected that the woman he loved might be anything other than what she appeared to be. But Mueller's public challenge had planted seeds of uncertainty that would inevitably grow into dangerous questions. "What kind of evidence could he possibly have?" Hannah asked, her tone mixing hurt with genuine bewilderment. "I was born in Rosenheim, educated in Munich, taught music at village schools until I met you. My entire life is documented in Reich records." It was true, as far as it went. Her fabricated identity had been constructed with meticulous attention to detail, every document forged by craftsmen who understood that lives depended on their precision. But no false identity could withstand unlimited scrutiny from investigators with access to the Reich's vast bureaucratic machinery. "I don't know," Eric admitted, finally turning to face her with eyes that held more pain than suspicion. "But I know Mueller. He's patient, methodical, utterly without mercy when he believes he's identified a threat to state security. If he's targeting you, it's because he believes he has discovered something that justifies the risk of challenging Kranz's authority." The train swayed slightly as it rounded a curve, the motion emphasizing the precarious balance of their situation. Outside, the German countryside rolled past like a film reel depicting a civilization in decline. Burned farmhouses, abandoned factories, refugee camps that had become permanent settlements for people displaced by their own government's appetite for expansion. "What should we do?" Hannah asked, though she already knew the answer would determine whether she lived or died in the coming hours. "We continue as if nothing has changed," Eric said, with the forced calm of a man trying to convince himself that normal behavior could restore normalcy to an abnormal situation. "You attend your usual social functions. I focus on my work. We maintain the life we've built together. Eventually, Mueller will either find evidence to support his suspicions or be forced to abandon his investigations." But Hannah understood that Mueller would never abandon an investigation once he had committed to it publicly. The SS officer's reputation depended on proving that his instincts about security threats were reliable, which meant he would pursue her destruction with the single-minded determination of a man whose career required vindication. More immediately, she had to find a way to transmit the intelligence that she had gathered at Peenemünde before Mueller's investigation made such contact impossible. The photographs hidden in her purse contained information that could save thousands of lives, but they were worthless unless Allied handlers could access them quickly enough to act on the intelligence they contained. That evening, as Berlin settled into the uneasy quiet that marked nights in a city under constant threat of air raids, Hannah made her way through streets where blackout curtains turned every window into a blind eye staring at nothing. Her destination was a small cafe in the Charlottenburg district where she had maintained contact with her handlers through carefully choreographed encounters disguised as coincidental meetings. The cafe was nearly empty at this hour, its few patrons nursing ersatz coffee while reading newspapers that contained more propaganda than information. Hannah took a table near the window, positioning herself where she could observe both the street and the interior, while maintaining the appearance of a woman seeking solitude after a difficult day. 20 minutes later, Dubois entered with the casual manner of a diplomat, seeking refuge from the pressures of wartime Berlin. He ordered coffee and selected a table 3 positions away from hers, close enough for communication, but far enough to avoid suspicion if they were being observed. "The weather has been unusually cold for this time of year," he commented in German, his voice carrying just enough volume to reach her without attracting attention from other patrons. "Yes," Hannah replied, understanding that he was confirming her readiness to proceed with an intelligence transfer. "Though I suspect it will become much colder soon." The coded exchange established that she had urgent information requiring immediate extraction. Dubois signaled his understanding by adjusting his newspaper to expose the back page, then rose to visit the restroom facilities. Hannah waited exactly 90 seconds before following, her movements casual but purposeful. The restroom corridor was empty, dimly lit by a single bulb that cast shadows deep enough to conceal their brief encounter. Dubois was waiting, his diplomatic immunity providing protection that made him invaluable as an intelligence conduit. "Peenemünde?" he asked without preamble. "Complete intelligence package," Hannah confirmed, transferring the camera to his coat pocket with movements so practiced they appeared accidental. Guidance systems, deployment schedules, production figures, targeting data. Everything Allied forces need to disrupt the rocket program. Müller. Active investigation. Probable exposure within days. I need extraction protocols. Dubois was quiet for a moment, his expression reflecting the grim calculations that marked intelligence work during wartime. Impossible through normal channels. Too much scrutiny. Too many watchers. You'll have to improvise. And if improvisation fails, then you ensure the intelligence reaches its destination even if you don't. His pale eyes met hers directly, offering no comfort or false reassurance. "The photographs you've provided could save more lives than any individual operation. That has to be the priority." The message was clear. Her survival was secondary to preserving the intelligence she had gathered. In the arithmetic of espionage, individual agents were expendable assets whose value was measured entirely by their contribution to larger strategic objectives. "Understood," Hannah replied, though the word tasted like ashes in her mouth. When she returned to her apartment, Eric was waiting in their bedroom with an expression that mixed love with desperate uncertainty. He had been drinking, not heavily, but enough to lower the barriers that normally kept his fears hidden beneath professional competence. "I've been thinking about what Müller said," he began without preamble, "about discrepancies in your background. And I realized there are things about you that I've never questioned, details that don't quite align with the stories you've told me." Hannah felt ice forming in her chest, understanding that this conversation would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise. "What kind of details?" "Your musical training, for instance. You claim to have studied at village schools, but your technique suggests conservatory-level education. Your knowledge of literature goes far beyond what a rural teacher would have encountered. Most tellingly, you sometimes speak German with such precision that it sounds almost studied." Each observation was delivered with the careful precision of a scientist documenting experimental results, but beneath Eric's analytical tone lay the pain of a man discovering that the woman he loved might be a carefully constructed illusion. "I've always been a quick learner," Hannah said carefully, "and I've had access to your library, your cultural connections. Perhaps marriage to you has educated me in ways I didn't expect." "Perhaps," Eric agreed, but his voice carried no conviction. "Or perhaps you're not the woman you've claimed to be. Perhaps Müller is right to investigate your background." The moment balanced on a knife's edge, everything she had built trembling on the verge of collapse. Hannah understood that any response she gave would either preserve her cover or destroy it completely, with no possibility of middle ground. She made her choice with the desperate calculation of a woman who had already lost everything that mattered most. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. "I'm not the woman you married. My name is not Hannah Schreiber. I was not born in Bavaria. I am not the devoted German wife I have pretended to be." Eric's face went white, his worst fears confirmed by words he had hoped never to hear. "Then who are you?" "I am Katarzyna Kowalski from Warsaw. I am a Polish intelligence officer whose family was murdered by German bombs. I married you to gather information about the rocket program, and I have been transmitting that intelligence to Allied forces for the past 2 years. The truth fell between them like a physical blow, destroying in seconds what had taken years to build." Eric staggered backward, his face cycling through expressions of shock, betrayal, rage, and something that might have been relief at finally understanding the source of his unconscious doubts. "Everything," he whispered, "everything between us was a lie." "Not everything," Hannah replied, though she knew the distinction would provide little comfort. "My respect for your intelligence was real. My appreciation for your kindness was genuine. My desire to protect you from harm was authentic. But not your love. No, not my love." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, marking the death of illusions that had sustained them both through 2 years of manufactured happiness. Eric sat heavily on their bed, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the effort of processing betrayal so complete it challenged his understanding of reality itself. "What happens now?" he asked without looking up. "Now I disappear," Hannah said with matter-of-fact acceptance. "Muller will expose me within days, probably hours. When he does, you'll be arrested as my accomplice unless I'm already gone, and you can claim ignorance of my true identity. And the intelligence you've gathered will save thousands of lives if it reaches Allied forces in time." She moved to their closet, selecting clothes that would allow her to blend into the anonymous crowds of wartime Berlin. "Your work, your brilliant engineering, will be turned against the people who created it. The rockets you've helped perfect will fail to reach their targets." Eric was quiet for a long moment, his engineer's mind working through implications and probabilities with mechanical precision. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new quality. Not acceptance exactly, but the grim recognition of consequences that could no longer be avoided. "How long do I have before they come for me?" "Hours, perhaps less. Mueller will move quickly once he has definitive proof of my identity." Hannah paused in her packing, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm sorry, Eric. You deserved better than to be used by someone who could never love you as you deserved. Did you ever feel anything real for me?" The question carried such pain that it took all her professional discipline to answer honestly. "I felt gratitude for your kindness. I felt admiration for your brilliance. I felt genuine sorrow that circumstances made you a target rather than simply a good man living his life. But not love. But not love." Eric nodded slowly, accepting the final confirmation of his deepest fears. "Then go. Disappear before they come. At least one of us should survive what we've built together." Hannah finished packing with efficient speed, reducing 2 years of manufactured life to a single suitcase, small enough to carry without attracting attention. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the bedroom door for one final look at the man who had been her unwitting partner in deception. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "in another world, in different circumstances, I think I could have loved you. You're a good man, Eric. I hope you remember that when they come for you." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the echo of her footsteps and the ruins of a marriage built on lies that had served truth. The nightingale had sung her final song in Berlin. Now Katarzyna Kowalski had to find her way home through a world that wanted her dead. The safe house was located in the basement of a bombed-out church in the Kreuzberg district, its entrance concealed behind rubble that appeared to be the result of Allied bombing, but had been carefully arranged to hide the passage that led to Allied operations in the heart of Nazi Germany. Hannah, she still thought of herself as Hannah, though that identity was rapidly becoming a memory, descended stone steps that were slick with moisture and the accumulated fear of agents who had used this refuge as their last hope of survival. The basement contained the basic necessities of clandestine warfare: radio equipment hidden behind false walls, forged documents arranged in neat files, weapons wrapped in oiled cloth, and enough food to sustain a small team for several weeks. But most importantly, it contained people who could help her navigate the treacherous path from Berlin to Allied lines. "You're burned," observed Heinrich Weber, the former German army officer who had turned against the Nazi regime after witnessing atrocities that challenged his understanding of honor and duty. At 63, he possessed the weathered competence of a man who had survived 2 wars by understanding that adaptability was more valuable than ideology. Mueller's investigation will expose your identity within hours, probably minutes after he discovers you've disappeared. "I know," Hannah replied, settling into a wooden chair that had probably been salvaged from the church's original furnishings. "But the intelligence I gathered at Peenemünde is worth any risk required to preserve it." Weber studied the photographs she had taken, his experienced eyes immediately recognizing the significance of what she had captured. Guidance systems, deployment schedules, targeting coordinates. This is a complete intelligence package. Allied bombers could use this information to cripple Germany's rocket program permanently. He looked up from the photographs with something approaching reverence. "How many lives do you think this could save? Thousands. Tens of thousands, perhaps." Hannah felt the weight of that responsibility settling over her like a shroud. V2 attacks on London alone have killed nearly 3,000 civilians. If Allied forces can disrupt production or develop countermeasures, then your mission will have justified every risk you've taken. Weber began organizing the photographs with methodical precision, preparing them for transmission through channels that led ultimately to Allied intelligence headquarters. But getting you out of Berlin alive will require resources we may not possess. The escape routes that had once carried Allied agents from Nazi territory to safety had been systematically compromised by German counterintelligence operations. SS and Gestapo units maintained constant surveillance of known safe houses, monitored suspicious activities with increasing sophistication, and executed captured agents with efficiency that discouraged recruitment of new operatives. "What options do we have?" Hannah asked, though she suspected the answer would be limited and dangerous. "3 possibilities, none of them ideal," Weber replied, consulting a map marked with routes that led through occupied Europe toward Allied lines. "First, we attempt to move you south through Austria into Italy, where partisan networks might be able to provide protection. Second, we try to get you to the Baltic coast, where Swedish fishing boats occasionally extract Allied personnel. Third, we keep you in Berlin and hope we can maintain your cover until Allied forces reach the city." Each option carried fatal risks that could destroy not just her escape attempt, but the entire intelligence network that had taken years to establish. Moving south would require crossing multiple security checkpoints where her false documents might not withstand scrutiny. The Baltic route involved trusting foreign networks whose loyalty was uncertain. Remaining in Berlin meant gambling that she could evade Mueller's investigation indefinitely. "What about transmission of the intelligence?" Hannah asked. "That's more important than my survival." "Already in progress," Weber assured her, gesturing toward the radio equipment that hummed quietly in the corner. "We're sending the photographs through multiple channels to ensure at least one package reaches Allied headquarters. Your mission is complete, regardless of what happens next." The words should have provided comfort. but instead they emphasized the lonely reality of her situation. She had achieved everything required of her as an intelligence operative. But now she faced the consequences of that success as an individual woman whose usefulness to the war effort was rapidly approaching its end. Outside, the sounds of a city under siege drifted through the basement walls. Air raid sirens, anti-aircraft fire, the distant rumble of explosions that marked another night of Allied bombing. Berlin was dying slowly, its infrastructure crumbling under constant attack, its population surviving on dwindling supplies, while their leaders demanded impossible victories from increasingly desperate positions. "There's something else you should know," Weber said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of bad news delivered by men who had learned to accept tragedy as routine. "Eric Schreiber was arrested 3 hours after you disappeared. Mueller's people found him in your apartment, probably waiting for interrogation to determine how much he knew about your real identity. The information hit her like a physical blow, guilt and regret mixing in her chest with emotions she had thought she had successfully suppressed. Eric had been an innocent victim of her mission, a good man whose only crime was falling in love with a woman who existed only as camouflage for an enemy agent. "Will they kill him?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Eventually, after they extract whatever information he possesses about your activities, your contacts, your methods of operation." Weber's expression remained professionally neutral, but she could see sympathy flickering in his pale eyes. "They'll want to understand how thoroughly you penetrated their rocket program, how much intelligence you gathered, how many other operations might be compromised." "He doesn't know anything useful. I was careful to compartmentalize operational details. That won't save him. In the current climate, association with an enemy agent is sufficient grounds for execution regardless of the subject's actual knowledge or cooperation law." The brutal arithmetic of wartime intelligence work offered no comfort for personal losses, no consideration for collateral damage that included innocent people whose only mistake was trusting the wrong person at the wrong time. Eric would die because he had loved her, because he had provided her with access to classified information, because his existence represented a security breach that required permanent resolution. "I want to help him," Hannah said, knowing even as she spoke that the request was impossible. "Impossible," Weber confirmed. "He's being held in Gestapo headquarters under maximum security. Any attempt to rescue or communicate with him would compromise our entire network without achieving anything useful. So I abandon him to die for my mission. You prioritize the greater good over personal sentiment. It's what every intelligence operative must learn to do if they want to remain effective." But effectiveness felt like cold comfort when measured against the human cost of her deception. She had saved thousands of lives by gathering intelligence about German rocket capabilities. But she had also destroyed the one person who had shown her genuine kindness during her years in Berlin. Over the following hours, as Weber's radio operators transmitted her photographs to Allied handlers and prepared forged documents for her escape attempt, Hannah found herself thinking about the woman she had been before the war transformed her into a weapon disguised as a wife. Katarzyna Kowalski had been a music teacher who believed in beauty, truth, and the power of art to elevate human experience. That woman seemed like a stranger now, her ideals as distant as childhood memories. The war had taught her that survival required abandoning such luxuries as honesty and love, that victory demanded sacrifices measured not just in blood, but in souls. She had become everything she once despised, a liar, a manipulator, a destroyer of innocence, because circumstances had made those transformations necessary for achieving larger objectives. But as dawn approached and Weber prepared to escort her to the first checkpoint on their chosen escape route, Hannah understood that some victories cost more than defeats. She had accomplished her mission, served her country, and helped turn the tide of war through intelligence that would save countless lives. She had also lost any chance of becoming the woman she might have been in a world where love didn't have to be a weapon and kindness wasn't a vulnerability to be exploited. The nightingale was flying toward freedom, but the song she carried was written in a language that would never sound like music again. London, March 1945. The rain fell on Bloomsbury with the persistent gentleness that marked English springs, washing the city clean of winter's accumulated grime while promising renewal that felt almost possible after 6 years of war. In a modest flat above a bookshop that specialized in volumes no one seemed eager to purchase, a woman sat by the window reading BBC reports of Allied advances into the heart of Germany. She was known to her neighbors as Miss Catherine Collins, a quiet refugee from continental troubles who kept to herself and spoke English with the kind of precise diction that suggested expensive education and careful practice. The woman who had been Katarzyna Kowalski, who had played Hannah Schreiber with such conviction that she sometimes forgot which identity was real, now inhabited this third persona, with the weary competence of someone who understood that names were simply tools to be discarded when they outlived their usefulness. The newspaper's headlines spoke of V-2 attacks that had mysteriously ceased, of German rocket sites abandoned due to targeting failures that Nazi engineers couldn't explain, of technological superiority rendered worthless by information that had somehow reached Allied forces at precisely the right moment. She read these reports with the detached interest of someone studying ancient history rather than consequences of her own actions. MI6 had debriefed her thoroughly upon her arrival, extracting every detail of her mission while treating her with the professional courtesy accorded to agents whose value was measured entirely by the intelligence they provided. The photographs from Peenemünde had exceeded all expectations, providing Allied forces with targeting information that allowed them to cripple Germany's rocket program just as it reached peak effectiveness. Thousands of lives saved, her handler had observed with satisfaction. Possibly tens of thousands, when you consider the planned attacks that will never occur. Your mission represents one of the most successful intelligence operations of the entire war. But success in espionage was measured differently than success in human terms, and Catherine found little comfort in statistical assessments of her achievement. The flat contained no photographs, no mementos, no evidence of the lives she had lived and discarded in service to larger causes. She existed in a kind of emotional quarantine, too damaged by deception to form genuine relationships, too valuable to be allowed the luxury of normal existence. The knock on her door came at precisely 4 o'clock, the timing suggesting official business rather than social visits she never received. Colonel Matthews from MI6 stood in the hallway, his weathered face carrying news that could be either assignment or conclusion. "Miss Collins," he said with formal courtesy, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Catherine replied, though interruptions always carried the potential for complications in her carefully controlled world. "Please, come in." Matthews entered her sparse living room with the careful movements of a man who understood that agents like Catherine existed in states of perpetual alert. The Nightingale of Berlin.